You think that crumpled piece of paper can stop my 120 homes? Karen Aldridge, the HOA president in a light-colored suit, stood in the middle of the Lakeshore construction site, laughing with contempt as she declared that my land now belongs to the community. But what she didn't know was that the very ground she stomped on with arrogant heels had already fallen neatly into the legal trap I had laid. This wasn't just personal revenge, it was a reminder that justice never sides with the abuser. If you've ever witnessed this kind of blatant abuse of power, comment below, what state are you in? My father once told me that land is more than just soil, it is memory. It is the blood and sweat of those who lived and labored on it. The plot at the edge of the Lakeshore area was where he built his first wooden house, where I ran barefoot on the grass, and where my mother planted rose bushes by the port. After they passed, I held on to that land like a treasure. Even as life pushed me from place to place, I always believed one day I would return and raise a new home for future generations, just as my father had. It was never just about ownership, but about a bond that tied our family by blood. That morning, when I came back to visit, I thought I had stumbled into a nightmare. Instead of the green field and the old wooden foundation, I saw excavators shrieking, cranes sweeping across the sky, and rows of concrete houses rising out of dust. Workers in reflective vests moved around, throwing me unfamiliar looks, treating me like I didn't belong. I was frozen in place, each step heavy as if glued to the earth. Right in front of me, the spot where my father once lit the fire for our meals was now crushed beneath cold blocks of cement. Amidst it all, Karen Aldridge appeared. She stood out in her light-colored suit, her hair dyed a glossy blonde, face etched with the arrogance of someone convinced they are always right. She didn't care who I was, didn't bother to ask why I was there. The moment she saw me standing stunned, she pointed toward the rows of construction and declared in a commanding voice, "This is community land. You have no say here." That sentence slapped me in the face. I pulled from my pocket the land use certificate, worn and creased by time, but the red stamp was still clear. I held it up, my hand trembling with rage, eyes locked straight on Karen. She squinted, glanced at the paper, then gave a dry laugh. The laugh of someone who believes the law is just a game in their hands. Not a single worker paused. The machines kept tearing into the ground, each sound slicing into my mind like a blade. A storm of fury rose inside me, impossible to put into words. Years of preservation, the memories of my parents, are now dismissed as worth. Karen stood there, voice cold and sharp, her contempt barely hidden. She called it community land, but I knew exactly what lay beneath those polished words: profit, power, and control. The way she looked at me didn't just deny my legal right, it erased my roots, my history, and the honor of my family. I gripped the land certificate tightly in my hand, grinding out each word to myself that I would never let Karen Aldridge and her HOA swallow this land whole. They could build hundreds of houses, but with just one legal misstep, I would bring the entire thing down. Standing in the chaos, I didn't just see land being stolen. I saw the truth laid bare, the arrogance, the disregard, the smug belief that even the law bent to their will. I turned and walked away, heart pounding, the imprint of the folded paper still marked in my palm. My father's words echoed in my mind. Land never betrays anyone, but you have to hold on to it, or others will trample it. Now I understood. This was no longer just about keeping land. This was a fight for justice, and Karen had just lit the spark for a battle she would never see coming. It didn't take me long to prepare for that HOA council meeting. In my hand was a file of land ownership documents, pages that had stayed with my family for generations, now the only shield between me and their audacity. The meeting room was elegantly decorated, chairs lined up neatly, and people gathered as if they were ready for a public trial. I walked in, and every gaze turned toward me, some curious, some mocking, some visibly smug. I stood at the podium, pulled out the documents, and spoke firmly. "This is the legal certificate of ownership. That land belongs to my family. You were wrong from the moment you laid the first brick." The room went silent for a second. Then mocking laughter broke out, spreading quickly across space. Karen Aldridge sat at the center, leaning back in her chair as if the entire room belonged to her. She curled her lip, tilted her head, and spoke clearly. "An old piece of paper against 120 homes? Who do you think you are?" Every word dripped with venom, both scornful and confident, meant to stir the crowd around her. Those seated in the front rows, mostly wealthy families, burst into laughter. A man in a gray suit whistled, and a few women wearing blindingly bright gold jewelry exchanged glances and giggled behind their hands. Scattered applause followed, not in support of truth, but in celebration of a public humiliation. The atmosphere turned heavy, every laugh pressing me further down. I stood tall, eyes locked on Karen. In my mind, the image of the construction site returned, the sound of excavators grinding through my family's memory. The rage surged, but I forced it down. If I let emotion take over, they'd have one more reason to call call me a lunatic fighting against the community. I gripped the file tighter, drew a deep breath, and answered, voice calm but sharp as a blade. One day, this very paper will be the reason you lose everything. The room paused. A few whispers rose, but I didn't look away from Karen. Her eyes flickered with a flash of surprise, quickly masked by a smirk. I knew then I had planted something, a sliver of doubt, crack in the wall of arrogance. I turned and stepped down, feeling every pair of eyes trailing behind me. Some were filled with contempt, some with uncertainty, and a few with a vague, uneasy concern. I knew from that moment on, this fight wasn't just words in a meeting room. It had become a battle between one person and a machine of power, where truth would be the only thing keeping me standing. Karen called after me, her voice syrupy sweet, but soaked in sarcasm. We'll be waiting for the day you bring that paper to court, and then you'll see just how worthless it is I didn't turn back. I only gripped the file tighter and smiled cold. In my mind, I already saw the day when the very people laughing now would be forced into silence as the evidence hit them square in the face. Stepping out of the meeting room, I lifted my head toward the sky. A strong gust of wind swept past, carrying with it the smell of dust and cement from the nearby construction site. I inhaled, grit hitting my lung, reminding me of the battle I could no longer avoid. Karen might think I'm at a disadvantage, might treat the entire community as her weapon, but she made one fatal mistake, underestimating the power of truth and the will of a man protecting his ancestral land. I told myself what happened today was only the prelude. All that mocking laughter would soon turn into fear once they realized those 120 homes stood on ground that had never belonged to them. And when that day comes, I won't need to shout because the truth will speak for me. In the days following that meeting, I began to see the true face of the HOA Karen Aldridge rolled. Within just 1 week, violation notices started piling up at my doorstep. First was for the wooden fence I had built since moving in. They claimed it didn't meet the community's aesthetic standard. I scoffed, thinking it was just petty retaliation after the public confrontation. But then came the second notice, the very next day, this time because the grass exceeded the permitted height by 2 centimeters. I looked at the neat, well-kept green lawn in front of my house and felt my chest tighten with fury. On the third day, I received another notice. Mailbox does not comply with the approved design. Color clashes with the neighborhood landscape. That mailbox had been left by the previous owner and was once approved by the board, yet now it has suddenly become evidence of visual disruption. I understood these weren't real violations. They were deliberate attempts to humiliate me, to drain my patience, force me out of this neighborhood. While I was buried under paperwork, I started watching others. A white family across the street left their garbage bins out front for 3 straight days, swarmed with flies, not a single warning. Another house strung up flashing lights all night, illuminating the entire block, yet no paper ever showed up on their door. I took mental notes of every detail, seeing more clearly with each passing day. Karen didn't want fairness. She wanted me broken, wanted me off this land like a loser walking away from a fight already decided. Then came the next month's HOA meeting. The hall looked the same, polished leather chairs, familiar faces, but the atmosphere was heavier. I sat in the middle, facing a row of crossed arms and cold stares, everyone ready to see me as prey. Karen stepped forward, her light-colored suit glowing under the lights, her voice smooth as syrup but sharp as a knife with every word. We all want to keep Lakeshore clean, fine, and reflective of our community values, but some people bring in other cultures that clearly don't belong here. She paused, cutting gaze locked onto me. Some people smirked, others nodded along, as if her words were gospel that needed no evidence. In that moment, I felt a lump of rage in my throat. Every passive threat had just been packaged into one contemptuous statement. She didn't have to say my skin color. She didn't have to point a finger. Everyone in the room understood exactly who she meant. I glanced around, catching a few sympathetic looks, but most were silent accomplices. I didn't stand up to argue. I swallowed everything, letting the anger settle inside me, because I knew the words she spoke today would be evidence tomorrow. Someone who's used to looking down on others will always reveal who they truly are, so long as someone has the patience to wait. When the meeting ended, Karen walked past me, leaned in slightly and whispered in my ear, "If you're smart, you'll sell your house and leave. That old land file of yours won't save you." I clenched my fist and looked straight into her eyes. I didn't say a word, but my stare alone was enough to make her turn away. On the way home, every word Karen said circling in my mind. She thought the violation notices would break me, but it was those very notices, along with the mocking tone she had just revealed, that would become the building blocks for my counterattack. I wouldn't forget, and I certainly wouldn't forgive. That day, My son came home from school looking completely different. He didn't say hello, didn't smile, just threw his backpack on the table and sat in silence, eyes red like he had swallowed an entire day of bitterness. I asked him what was wrong. He hesitated, then choked up. They said our family stole land. They said the whole neighborhood hates you. Each word cut through my chest like a blade. I was used to the contempt spewed by adults at those HOA meetings, but having a child bear that same humiliation, that was something I couldn't accept. I knew immediately there was only one possible source: Karen Aldridge. In the community she controlled, rumors were planted with a single cruel comment and spread like wildfire. Children repeated what they heard from parents, parroting the words as if to prove their loyalty to that twist collect. My son had done nothing wrong, yet now he carried the label land thief simply because I dared to stand up to her. I went straight to the HOA office, where Karen was chatting with a few of the neighborhood's wealthy residents. When she saw me, she crossed her arms and smirked, her voice smooth like a well-rehearsed script. Kids sometimes tell the truth better than adults. If this doesn't feel right to you, maybe it's time to sell and leave. She said it in front of everyone, without a hint of shame. My chest burned as I listened. That offhand comment wasn't just a denial of my ownership. It was a direct blow to my family's dignity. I stared straight into her eyes, speaking every word through clenched teeth. You just came for my son. This isn't just about land anymore. There was a brief silence around, a few surprised glances. Karen didn't flinch. She raised an eyebrow as if my words lacked weight. Maybe she was used to people who backed down when threatened, but she had miscalculated. On the way home, something unfamiliar stirred inside me. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a resolve that could not be undone. The land was mine, and I had sworn to protect it. But this had gone beyond paperwork. This was about the survival of my family, the honor of my son, and a lesson I had no choice but to teach Karen. When she dragged a child into her games, she crossed a line that should never be touched. That night, I sat beside my son. He stayed quiet, face heavy with everything he didn't know how to say. I didn't make promises or say anything sweet. I just placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't need to believe what they say, because I'm going to show them the truth. One day, the same people calling you a thief will have to bow their head." In his eyes, I saw a faint glimmer of belief. It was small, but enough to remind me I didn't have the right to fall. Fire rose inside me that left no path to If before I was fighting for land, now I was fighting for the dignity and future of my child. Karen thought a few slanders could scare me into walking away, but she was wrong. From that moment on, I swore I would not let a single person in that HOA have the chance to turn my family into a joke. I would turn every insult my son endured into evidence against, and I would make sure Karen Aldridge understood exactly what it cost, what is sacred to me. On the day of the grand opening ceremony, the entire neighborhood was mobilized to turn the event into a stage show for what they called the Pride of Lakeshore. Bright red banners hung everywhere, rows of tables and chairs were lined up, and loudspeakers blasted cheerful music. They called it a celebration, but all I saw was a performance meant to legitimize the act of theft. On the very land that once belonged to my father, they raised glasses and cheered as if they had achieved something historic. I walked into the crowd, clutching the land certificate in my hand, eyes turned toward me. Some curious, some irritated, but most carried the same sneering look. I stood tall, took a breath, then raised the folder high. My voice cut through the music and the chatter. "You are building on my land." The words sliced through the air. The noise dipped for a second, whispers sparked here and there, but all attention quickly turned to the stage, where Karen Aldridge was stepping out with a microphone in hand. Karen wore her signature light-colored suit, beaming as if I had just handed her the perfect spotlight. She laughed loudly, the sound magnified by the speakers, echoing across the field. "Everyone knows this land belongs to the community. Don't let an outsider ruin our joy." She gestured toward me, voice smooth and sweet like syrup, but every word dripping with contempt. The crowd burst into a collective roar, a few clapping as if her insults part of the program. I stood still, heat rushing to my face. In that moment, Karen's intent became crystal clear. To turn me into a public joke, to snuff out any voice of dissent. Laughter spread, and the way people looked at me made it obvious. I was a disruption, a clown, threat to their manufactured harmony. They didn't need facts, didn't want truth, only the illusion handed down from the one standing on the stage. I swallowed the humiliation, my eyes never leaving Karen. She smiled with satisfaction and carried on with her speech about Lakeshore's bright future, while I silently recorded every word, every gesture. I knew I didn't have enough to bring her down, not yet, but this ceremony, this farce in front of me, gave me something far more valuable, fuel to set the trap. I lowered my hand and slowly turned to walk away. Behind me, the speakers kept spilling their fake praises, the laughter still rolling like they had just crushed an enemy. I didn't shout back. I didn't protest. Instead, in my mind, I began fitting together every piece, every bit of evidence I had, and what I still needed. They laughed today, but I knew the day was coming when this very spot would be where they bowed their heads in disgrace. Karen might have thought she had silenced, that I had nothing left and would retreat, but as I left the crowd, I made myself a promise. Today wasn't a grand opening. It was the opening act to her downfall, and I would be the one standing at the center, watching it all unfold. I didn't go home right after that humiliating grand opening ceremony. Instead, I called an old acquaintance, someone who had once helped my father resolve land paperwork years ago. His name was Richard Hale, a retired attorney who still kept in touch with my family. I gave him a brief rundown of the current situation, about the houses going up, about how Karen Aldridge publicly turned my land into community property. Richard paused for a moment, then told me to bring all the original documents. He would review everything from the beginning. We met in his small office downtown. It wasn't busy like it used to be, but everything inside was neat and orderly, just like his personality. I laid the file on his desk, the pages worn and frayed from the years. Richard opened them one by one, eyes moving slowly, occasionally furrowing his brow. I sat beside him waiting, my heart pounding. After nearly an hour, he looked up, voice rough with surprise. You know, the contract the HOA is relying on, it was never properly registered. They fabricated boundary lines to extend their control, but legally, everything they've done is invalid. Those words pierced through the darkness in my mind. All the rage I'd bottled up shifted into cold, clear focus. I asked for every detail, and Richard pointed out the flaw, the altered cadastral map, the portion of my family's land reassigned to the HOA without any official authorization. It was a series of calculated violation, but they had left behind fatal gap. I left his office with a full copy of the evidence, my head burning with both fury and strategy. Karen was that confident, then she had clearly never imagined someone would be patient enough to dig all the way back to the beginning. And the moment she believed herself untouchable, that was exactly when she became most vulnerable. The next day, I visited a legal insurance firm and quietly signed a full coverage protection. This wasn't just for defense, it was a strategic step toward retaliation. While Karen was still basking in the sound of applause and mockery in the town hall, I had already placed a chess piece on the board she didn't even know. They thought I was a beaten man clinging to an old paper, but I knew that very document was the match that burned down their whole illusion of power. That night, I sat in the living room, the yellow lamp casting a glow over the papers spread out on the table. Outside the window, wind howled through half-finished homes, the construction noise echoing like a challenge. I stared at the red seal stamped on the land certificate, laid my hand on it like I was touching the heartbeat of my parent. I whispered to myself, each word steady and sharp, "Let's see who's still laughing when she walks into a trap I built myself." I knew from that moment forward, the balance had shifted. Karen Aldridge could flaunting her authority, keep using microphones to shame me in public, but behind the curtain, every piece of this legal trap was slowly locking into place. And when the time came, I wouldn't need to scream. The truth would turn itself into a blade, slicing straight through the mask of power she always wore. I didn't rush to release the evidence Richard Hale had uncovered about the fraudulent contract. I knew that if I pulled the trigger too soon, Karen Aldridge would have time to maneuver. Instead, I chose bait, something that would shake public opinion. I still had the video on my phone, the one where she stood at the construction site, pointing at the houses and shouting, "This land belongs to HOA now." Her voice was loud and arrogant, amplified by the site's speakers. Impossible to deny. I sent that to a journalist I knew at the local paper, along with one short line. "Take a look at what fairness really means in Lakeshore." Within a day, the article with the video was published, and everything exploded beyond what I expected. The clip spread like wildfire, not just locally, but across major forums. Thousands of comments poured in, outraged by the audacity of a council claiming to protect the community while blatantly seizing land. The hashtags #wrongland and #HOATrap quickly climbed trending charts, appearing all over social media. Every time I checked my phone, another resident from another state had reposted the clip with the caption, "If this happened in your neighborhood, what would you do?" Inside the Lakeshore community, the tide started to turn. They had only heard Karen's version, only seen me through the distorted lens she created, but now it was Karen's own arrogant voice that exposed everything. I overheard whispers on the street, people murmuring, "What if he's right? What if the land really doesn't belong to the HOA? Are we living on an illegal foundation?" Doubt spread everywhere, from morning coffee meetup to backyard conversation. Karen, of course, didn't sit still. She held a press conference right in the community hall, flanked by a lineup of HOA board members as a backdrop. In front of the cameras, she wore the same light-colored suit, kept her familiar smile, but her eyes gave away the tension. "This is a deliberate attempt to sabotage our community," she declared, her voice high-pitched. "The person who released this video is an outsider who knows nothing about Lakeshore's values and is trying to stir chaos for personal gain. I watched the press conference on screen and laughed. The more she denied, the more the public grew suspicious. She didn't present any evidence, never once mentioned legal documentation, and only focused on attacking me. People who once supported her began to feel uneasy, questioning, if she's in the right, why not prove it? Why just label him a troublemaker? What I had hoped for was happening. The trust in Karen was eroding day by day. The more she defended herself, the more she exposed the fact that her power was built on hollow words. While she kept insisting she was protecting the community, the public saw a dictator afraid of the truth. I didn't need to say much. That video alone was enough to show the entire country the arrogant face of the Lakeshore HOA, and the murmurs spreading through the neighborhood were my most effective weapon. Once trust begins to crack, no statement can patch it. I knew the first trap had closed. Karen Aldridge had just taken another step into it. That month's HOA meeting was hastily organized, and the atmosphere in the room felt drastically heavier than usual. After Karen's video went viral and public outrage erupted, I knew she was forced to call this meeting in an attempt to calm the crowd. She stepped up to the podium with a strained smile, her light-colored suit gleaming under the light, repeatedly emphasizing phrases like sustainable future and community pride. She acted as if nothing had happened, as though the video was just some silly, manipulated clip. But the energy in the room was completely different. Whispers buzzed from the back rows, and people glanced at one another, eyes filled with doubt. While Karen went on and on about long-term benefits, suddenly, an old man in the front row stood up. His name was Thomas. He had lived in Lakeshore for over 20 years, known for being gentle and rarely involved in dispute. For as long as anyone could remember, he had always been the type to nod along with every HOA decision, never once speaking out. Thomas's voice was low, firm. I used to believe in the HOA. Now I see I was wrong. The words echoed through the silent room, bouncing off the wall. All eyes turned toward him, and then a wave of murmurs swept across. The silence that had held everyone back for so long was finally shattered. Others began to stand. First, just a few voices of agreement, then more. A woman raised her hand, her voice trembling but resolute. I got fined for parking on the street for one night, while Karen's house throws loud parties past midnight. I stayed quiet, but not anymore. A man followed, his voice sharp. They fined me for hanging an old flag on my porch, said it ruined the aesthetic. But HOA signs selling homes are plastered all over the lake. That's fair? One by one, each complaint fell like rain. The crowd, once silent, had become a roaring river. I could see the anger had been simmering for years. All it needed was a spark. Thomas had lit it. Karen's panic was visible. Face turned red, eyes scanning the room wildly. A shrill, bitter shout burst out. You've all been fooled by him. Don't let an outsider like him tear us apart. She pointed straight at me, voice cracking with rage. But instead of calming the crowd, her outburst only made them more uncomfortable. The faces below no longer looked at me like I was the troublemaker. They looked at Karen like a tyrant who had just lost control. I stood and walked slowly toward the podium. No microphone needed, just a steady voice. No, it's you who fooled this entire community. I turned to the rows of seats, letting each person see how calm I was. In sharp contrast, Karen's panic. She fined people for nothing, created rules just to force someone out. She calls this pride, but it's built on greed and lies. Don't you all see you've been used? In an instant, the entire hall erupted in applause and shouts of support. Faces that once looked hesitant now held their heads high. They were no longer afraid. Karen took a step back, her lips moving but unable to form any word. I knew from that moment on, the balance had shifted completely. The crowd had awakened, and she no longer held the reins of power in her hand. I stared directly at Karen, sensing the tremble behind her hardened expression. This twist hadn't come from me. It came from a resident who had once stayed silent, and that was the real blow. When trust disappears, authority becomes nothing more than an empty shell. I stepped down, blending into the crowd, letting them continue to speak truth that had been suppressed for so long. And I thought to myself, Karen Aldridge had just taken another step deeper into the trap she never saw coming. It didn't take long after that chaotic meeting for Karen Aldridge to strike back. One morning, I received a thick envelope stamped with the logo of a well-known law firm in the city. Inside was a lawsuit filled with a string of accusations: defamation, damaging the community's reputation, and obstructing lawful construction. I read every line but found no solid argument, just legal intimidation tactics. It was clear Karen believed the prestige of that firm would scare me, or at least make me hesitate. I smiled because it was all within expectation. I met with my old attorney, Richard Hale, and placed the envelope on his desk. He glanced through it and let out a dry chuckle. "This is a scare tack, nothing more. But I think it's time you showed them the real card." I nodded, pulled from my briefcase the original cadastral map, complete with the red seal of a government agency, something no one could dispute. On the day I brought the map to the settlement meeting, Karen arrived with 2 young attorneys, all confidence and polish. She sat upright, arms crossed, eyes triumphant. Her lawyers spoke at length, rattling off a list of vague evidence. When they finished, I slowly unfolded the map on the table, the bold red seal catching everyone's eye. I said clearly, "This is the official cadastral map. The land you're building on has never belonged to the HOA. Every other document is fake." The room went silent. Karen looked down at the map, her expression flickering. Her hands trembled slightly, then clenched as she tried to compose herself. Frozen moment passed across a face long practiced in pretending to be confident. But instead of acknowledging the truth, she shot to her feet, her voice shrill and jarring enough to make both her lawyers flinch. "We will sue until the end. No one can destroy this HOA, not even you." I stood, calmly rolled the map back up, and let a cold smile cross my lip. I didn't need to yell or argue. That red seal alone was weighty enough to the entire board. I looked directly at Karen, letting her see there was no more defense in my eyes, only the readiness to strike. Her shouting now sounded like the last death cry from the bottom of a pit. As I left the meeting, I knew one thing for certain: the tide had turned. From now on, Karen could keep thrashing, but the more she resisted, the more her true nature would show. I was no longer just a man clutching an old piece of paper. I now held a razor-sharp legal blade, and with it, I would sever every piece of power Karen Aldridge had built. Karen Aldridge's legal counterattack didn't scare me. Instead, it stirred unrest within the HOA itself. Less than a week after the settlement meeting, I received word that a board member had submitted his resignation. It was David Coleman, a middle-aged man long seen as Karen's right. In a letter addressed to all residents, he wrote plainly, "I can no longer participate in a council manipulated by one person, where truth is distorted and residents are misled. Mrs. Aldridge has not only deceived the community, but has also betrayed her own board." His words cut straight through Karen's authority, sending a ripple through the neighborhood. Before, my claims were dismissed as the ramblings of a lone man. Now someone who had once stood firmly on Karen's side publicly turned his back. Conversations grew louder and more frequent, not just whispered in private, voiced openly during gathering. When Karen tried to organize a quick meeting to restore control, she didn't expect the residents to stop sitting quiet. One by one, people raised their hands and asked direct, fearless questions. "Where has our fine money gone over the past few years?" a woman asked, her voice shake firm. "Why did lake maintenance fees double while the quality still declined?" a man interrupted. The noise rose like waves, no longer muted by blind consensus. Karen stood at the podium, forcing her usual smile, but her face began to stiffen. When questioned about the financial records, she dodged and promised vaguely to review and inform later. But the residents were no longer swallowing sweet words. "We want to see them now," a man's voice called from the back. The demand dropped heavily across the room, followed by others echoing the same. Karen faltered, gripping her folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. I stood out in the hallway, looking in through the doorway, watching the cracks spread through the walls of power Karen had built. The crowd that once shielded her was now the whip turning back on its mask. The same faces that once mocked me were now stern and uncertain. I didn't need to step in, didn't need to shout. They were asking the questions. That night, I returned home and sat at my desk thinking. I knew what had just happened was only the beginning. A board like the HOA, no matter how fragile, still held strands of power. But once trust starts to crumble, it only takes one decisive blow to bring the whole structure down. Karen might still be proud, might still have her microphone and spotlight, but what she lacked now was the trust of those who once stood behind her. I closed my eyes and pictured her faltering before a crowd, no applause left to lift her up, and I knew that day was closer than ever. On the day the trial officially opened, the air was thick with tension. I arrived early with my attorney, carrying the file that Richard Hale and I had meticulously prepared over several weeks. Outside the courthouse, Lakeshore residents gathered in clusters, some curious, others carrying a look that demanded answers to the doubts they'd quietly held for so long. Reporters jostled for position, cameras sweeping across the crowd, ready to capture every second. Karen Aldridge arrived with a full legal entourage, walking in as if she still had control over everything. She wore her usual light-colored suit, heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, her proud gaze skimming the faces in the crowd. Maybe she thought this show of force would make me flinch. I looked at her, and all I felt was a cold contempt. No matter how confident she pretended to be, she couldn't cover the truth waiting inside that courtroom. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. I stood, placing the file on the table before me. The sound of the folder hitting the wood rang clear, slicing through the artificial atmosphere Karen had tried to maintain. I opened each page and presented my case methodically. The original cadastral map, the land contract, and the evidence proving that every construction permit the HOA had used was based on falsified boundaries. Each document landed like a blade, cutting through the outer shell of Karen's power. Her legal team scrambled to interject, citing clauses and bylaws, but the more they spoke, the weaker they sounded. They sidestepped the core evidence, circling around irrelevant details. The judge, a silver-haired man seasoned by decades on the bench, frowned as he examined the stack of permits Karen's team had submitted. He turned them over repeatedly, his expression growing more severe. Then he struck his gavel, his voice firm and resonant. "These building permits are invalid." That sound hit like a bolt of lightning. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, few gasps escaping into the open air. I looked over at Karen and saw her frozen in her seat. Hands once resting calmly on her lap now gripped the armrest, her knuckles pale, face drained of color, lips pressed tight, eyes darting as if searching for something to hold on to. Every trace of arrogance she had carried in was now gone, placed by a look of panic. I sat still, without any need for a victorious smile. The judge's words were enough. Justice had made its stance clear. I let Karen sit in that moment, exposed in public, under the light, cameras, and the eyes of hundreds. From now on, she was no longer the one holding the mic, drowning me out. She was the accused, face to face with the truth. In that moment, I knew the scales had completely. Karen might still struggle, hire more lawyers, or pull more tricks, but the truth had been laid bare. The homes built on my family's land would never again be symbols of Lakeshore pride. They were now nothing more than proof of the greed and arrogance that led the HOA to its downfall. After the judge declared the building permits invalid, the air in the courtroom remained thick with tension. Karen Aldridge sat frozen, while her two attorneys scrambled to gather their papers, trying to salvage something. I knew the blow had landed hard, but my lawyer gave me a subtle nod, signaling that we still had one more card to play. He stepped forward slowly and inserted a small USB drive into the speaker system. A faint clicking sound came from the speakers. Then Karen's voice filled the room, unmistakable and undeniable. "Once the houses are finished, you can't do anything." Her tone was cold, laced with the same arrogance I had seen in her eyes from the beginning. Now it echoed through the courtroom, reaching every ear. No longer my word against hers, but her own confession laid bare. The room erupted. Whispers swelled into gasps. Some people chuckled bitterly. Others muttered aloud. "She really said that?" The judge immediately struck his gavel, demanding silence, but even he couldn't mask the look of disgust spreading across his face. I looked at Karen. Her entire expression collapsed. Her shoulders trembled, fingers digging into the armrest. From the start of the trial, she had clung to the posture of someone in control, but one short recording had shattered the mask. She stared down at the floor, her hair falling over her face, unable to look anyone in the eye. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. Everyone in the courtroom had heard her voice, heard the contempt for the law, the cruelty behind the sweet smiles she once used to lull the community. The murmurs continued to ripple through the crowd, like a verdict that required no ink. In that moment, I knew every attempt Karen had left to fight back was finished. She had no defense, no escape. That recording wasn't just evidence, it was a turning point, shifting the minds of the entire Lakeshore community. And Karen's bowed head was the clearest confession of all. I sat quietly, taking in a deep breath. This twist wasn't about winning a case. It was about proving to everyone that truth always finds a way to speak, and today it had spoken in Karen Aldridge's own voice. After the recording echoed through the courtroom, everything changed. The Lakeshore residents, once quick to applaud every time Karen Aldridge publicly humiliated me, now sat packed into the benches, glancing at one another with guilt in their eyes. They whispered, then slowly began to stand. A man's voice rang out, clear and firm. "She lied to us." The words weren't just aimed at Karen. They sounded like a collective confession that they had trusted blindly for far too long. Voices followed in succession, one after another, no longer hesitant. A woman stood abruptly, her voice cracking with tears. "I sold my parents' house for cheap because of her constant fine." Every time I pushed back, another notice showed up. Now I see, it was all a tact force me out. Her sobs silenced the room. Heads bowed across the courtroom, as others realized they too had once contributed to the silence that enabled it all. I looked at Karen, motionless in the front row, face locked in place. I stepped forward, voice low but sharp as a blade. They've all woken up. Only you remain blind. Each word landed heavily, thickening the air. I saw Karen flinch, her shoulders tensing, hands gripping the chair. For the first time, there was no smirk, no dismissive laugh, only silence. A silent wave surged through the courtroom. Those who had once stayed quiet now began recounting their own experiences of unfair treatment, of being trampled by the HOA. A middle-aged man said, "I used to think he was making it up to stir trouble, but now I know I was blind. We were all you." His words brought nods from every direction. The truth was laid bare, undeniable, and complete. Karen tried to lift her head, her lips moving as if to speak, but the collective gaze of the crowd stopped her cold. I could feel her trembling, the collapse of years of manufactured agreement unfolding in front of her. No more applause. No more praise, only the fury of those she once manipulated. I stood still, watching it all. This wasn't a moment for triumph, but a reckoning, a moment for the community to finally face the truth they had long chosen to ignore. And now that it was exposed, Karen Aldridge was no longer the one in power, but simply a woman shrinking beneath the weight of her own betrayal. The moment of reckoning came faster than anything Karen Aldridge could have imagined. After reviewing the full case file and hearing all testimonies, the judge slammed the gavel and spoke firm clarity. All 120 houses were built on unlawfully held land. They must either be dismantled or fully compensated to the rightful landowner. The courtroom fell into dead silence, then exploded like a wave breaking on rock. The public buzzed, reporters scribbled furiously, and cameras panned wildly across the room. I remained seated, shaken inside, outwardly composed. Every effort, every moment of restraint had led to this day. The 120 houses once paraded by the HOA as the pride of Lakeshore were now officially symbols of deceit. Every brick, every slab of concrete would no longer represent their authority, but stand as living proof of blind greed. On the opposing bench, panic spread quickly. Several HOA board members quietly packed their papers, avoiding eye contact before slipping out the side. Some hung their heads in shame. Others covered their faces and fled from reporters' lenses. The unity they once paraded collapsed in seconds. No one wanted to bear the weight of accountability, and that chaos was the clearest image of an institution in ruin. Karen Aldridge still sat in the front row, but I could see she no longer had the strength to keep up appearances. Her powdered face was streaked with sweat, her lipstick smeared. As the judge finished reading the verdict, she slumped into her seat, hands clutching the armrest, nails digging in until they bled. The woman who once declared with pride, "This land belongs to the community," now looked shattered, stripped of all control. I watched it unfold, a cold stillness rising inside. There was no cheering, no loud celebration. Only a deep silence settles in my mind like a door quietly closing. I allowed myself a quiet smile. Not the grin of vengeance, but the expression of someone who knew just finally found its way home. Outside the courthouse, the crowd began to roar. Some who had once supported Karen now shouted for answers. Microphones were shoved forward and questions came fast with no way out. I walked past it all, leaving the chaos to wrap itself around Karen and her crumbling HOA. In my mind, there was only one thought. This collapse was not my doing. They had led themselves here, driven by endless greed and arrogance. And as I turned my back, leaving the noise behind me, I knew that from this day forward, Lakeshore would no longer be the HOA's land. It had returned to its rightful place, land of truth, cleansed by a public verdict. The morning after the trial, I woke to the sound of my phone ringing nonstop. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers sent me links to news articles, all bearing the same bold headline, "HOA President Defeated." Dozens of outlets, from local papers to national publications, reported and analyzed the case, calling it one of the most staggering collapses of a homeowners association in recent years. Karen Aldridge, once firmly seated as president, had become the face of its downfall. The news spread fast, with TV stations updating by the hour. I watched the noon broadcast and saw footage of Karen leaving the courthouse, her makeup smeared, her eyes swollen red, her mouth crying out in desperation. The cameras zoomed in on every tear, every hopeless grasp at the arm of her attorney. That image was replayed over and over, a public reminder that all the arrogance she once wore had shattered completely. Karen didn't just lose her reputation, she lost everything financially. The court's ruling forced the HOA to dismantle or fully compensate for the 120 illegally built homes, and since she was the one in charge, every liability now fell on her shoulders. Banks issued notices freezing freezing all accounts under the name Karen Aldridge. The investments she once bragged about, the luxury properties she once flaunted, were now being seized one by one to pay off the debt. Residents talked endlessly. Some called it price of arrogance. Others sneered, she used to make us tremble with her violation notices. Now look at her trembling in front of the entire country. Those who once hailed Karen as a community figurehead now turned on her without hesitation, pushing her straight into the pit of disgrace. I watched all those images without needing to cheer or celebrate. Everything had unfolded like the inevitable result of her own action. Karen Aldridge had sown the seed, and now she was harvesting what she deserved. In one interview, a reporter asked how I felt watching my opponent collapse like. I answered plainly, eyes locked on the camera, she deserved it. Nothing more was needed, because the entire nation had already seen what she had done. The truth is, I never wished for anyone to fall into ruin, but I knew justice meant nothing if those who wronged others walked away free. Karen once believed that power and wealth gave her permission to trample over the law, over other people's dignity. But in the end, it was the law and the community that exposed and left her with nowhere to run. That night, I sat alone in my small house, turned on the TV, and saw Karen crying again across every channel. I let out a quiet breath, not out of pity, but with the sense that a long chapter had closed. I thought of my son, of the day he was called a land thief by his classmates, and how that memory had now been replaced by the image of the one who caused it all being shamed on national television. I told myself, this wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for truth, and the words "she deserved it" weren't a harsh judgment, but a fair sentence the entire community had witnessed, from beginning to end. After Karen Aldridge's downfall, the atmosphere in Lakeshore changed dramatically. The residents, who had silently endured for so long, began gathering to talk about the future of their neighborhood. For the first time in years, they spoke openly about the injustices, the murky, and the unreasonable fines that had pushed so many families to the edge. Those conversations quickly turned into a movement. Within days, a petition to dissolve the HOA circulated through each household sign, every signature a declaration. They had had enough of authoritarian power disguised as community interest. One afternoon, the residents gathered on the front steps of City Hall to submit the sheet, covered in signatures, stretched out like a map of solidarity. As the representative handed it to the authority, the crowd fell into a tense silence. Then, an elderly man stepped forward, silver hair trembling in the breeze, his hand shaking as he held the microphone. His voice cracked but was firm. "We've been afraid too long, afraid of the fines posted on our doors, afraid of the threats that came when we spoke out. Today, we choose not to be afraid anymore." Those words struck a chord. Many faces lowered, remembering the days they had chosen silence. Some clenched their fists, others quietly wiped away tears. The tremble in the old man's voice wasn't weakness. It was the weight of what he had endured, finally released. I stepped forward, looking out across the crowd, and spoke clearly. "From now on, no one is allowed to intimidate this community again. No one has the right to hold us hostage to greed and arrogance." I saw the light return to their eyes, as if their trust was being reignited. My words needed no embellishment. They arrived at just the right moment, in a space where everyone longed for a definitive affirmation. The crowd erupted. Applause broke out like thunder, echoing across the wide courtyard. Some people shouted, many embraced. There was no more division, no more skeptical glances, only the power of unity. That applause wasn't just for me, it was for them, for their decision to rise after so many years of bowing their head. I looked into every face, even recognizing those who had once applauded my humiliation, now part of the same crowd. They were no longer ashamed to admit their mistakes, because justice doesn't require perfection. It only asks that people have the courage to change. And today, Lakeshore had done just that. The applause was still ringing in my ears as I stepped down from the podium. I knew that from this moment on, the name HOA in Lakeshore would be nothing more than a stain in memory, and ahead lay a freer, more transparent community where every voice would be heard. After the petition to dissolve the HOA was approved by the authorities, the following days in Lakeshore took on an entirely new character. The city sent a representative to work with residents and discuss a replacement model. There was no trace of Karen Aldridge or her arbitrary fines, only open meetings where anyone could speak up, where everyone had the right to ask questions. After several discussions, the new neighborhood council was officially approved by the city, operating under the principles of transparency and democracy. All finances had to be public, and every decision required consensus. On the day the new new board was announced, the air was filled with relief. Those who had once remained silent now raised their hands to speak, no longer afraid of being named or fined. Many people nominated me for a leadership position, believing I was the one who had brought truth back to this neighborhood. But when I stood before everyone, I gently shook my head. I will take part, I said, but I will not accept a leadership role. The room gasped, surprised and curious. I looked around and spoke slowly. I don't need power. I need justice to remain. We've seen how power can be abused, how a single person can impose their will on an entire community. What I want is for that to never happen. Here, everyone must have a voice, and that voice must be respected. As soon as I finished speaking, a brief silence fell, then applause erupted. The elderly, the youth, the women, all nodded in agreement, taking it as a new standard. No one wanted to return to a time when a small group decided for everyone else. My words became the guiding principle for the new neighborhood board, a reminder to anyone elected that leadership does not mean standing above others, but protecting fairness for all. Since that day, I've continued attending the meetings, offering my thoughts, always sitting in the same row as everyone else. I want people to understand that this new order is not built on any one individual, but on unity. And when I see the peace smiles on the faces of the residents, I know Lakeshore has finally returned to what a community is truly meant to be. Not long after the court's ruling, the personal price Karen Aldridge had to pay revealed itself day by day, clearer and more bitter than any formal sentence. She lost her home, her reputation, and the very people who once clapped and cheered around her. The grand house with the magazine-worthy lawn, once the site of lavish parties flaunting her wealth, now hung with a foreclosure notice. The bank seized it, the press photographed, and neighbors whispered each time they passed by. Those who once felt honored to be invited by her now avoided her name like a stain. Friends turned their backs swift, even faster than they once praised her. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who turned an entire community into a national farce. On social media, images of Karen beaming in her signature light-colored suits were now paired with thousands of mocking comments. The entire persona she had meticulously built over the years collapsed in an instant. Karen's family didn't escape the fallout either. One evening, after the neighborhood lights had dimmed, a moving truck quietly pulled up to her home. People saw boxes being carried out, doors shutting quickly, then the truck pulling away into the night. No words were spoken, no farewells exchanged with neighbors. The entire family left Lakeshore like fugitives, leaving behind an empty house and a name turned into a cautionary tale. I stood from a distance, watching the truck's headlights vanish down the road, felt no triumph. There was no victorious joy, no satisfaction in the humiliation of someone who once oppressed me, only a cold but steady sense that this was just. The truth had come to light. Karen Aldridge was receiving the ending she had sown for herself. I reminded myself, those who sow the wind will reap the storm. No one can thrive forever on lies and the fear of others. Karen believed her power allowed her to rise above the law and public conscience, but in the end, that same power became the trap that closed around her. This price wasn't something I imposed. It was the consequence of her own arrogant choices. That night, I returned home and sat in silence. Outside, the Lakeshore community was slowly coming back to life, but the image of that truck disappearing into the dark stayed with me. It stood as proof that justice may be slow, but when it arrives, it spares no one. After months of dealing with the aftermath, the rows of illegally constructed concrete houses finally vanished from the land. The sounds of excavators and hammers smashing down walls, once proudly showcased by the HOA, now rang out like the final bell tolling for an era of deception. The people of Lakeshore stood and watched, not with regret, but with a shared sense of relief. They had once been forced to believe those buildings were symbols of community pride, but now all they saw was a pile of rubble, a vivid monument to arrogance erased. The city government didn't let the vast empty lot go to waste. They announced a redevelopment plan to turn the former scar into a community park. Instead of fences and unauthorized homes, space would be green, open, and welcoming to all. Residents participated in discussions and helped plan the layout, each person eager to contribute to transforming this tainted land into something genuinely worthy of pride. I was present at those meetings too, not as someone fighting to reclaim their right, but simply as a neighbor helping future. On the day the park was inaugurated, I stood on the ground that had once been taken from me, quietly observing the transformation. In place of gray foundations, now lies a lush green lawn. Children ran and laughed, their joy echoing throughout. Adults gathered in conversation, and you elders sat on stone benches enjoying the afternoon sun. The scene lifted a weight from my heart that had pressed down for years. Father's land, once filled with our family's memories, had now become a place for the entire community to create new. I chose a small patch near the lake, where the sunlight was softest, to plant an oak tree. I wanted it to stand as witness to every rise and fall, from the day the land was seized ease to the day it was returned with honor. As I dug the hole, placed the sapling, and covered the roots with soil, I felt like I was planting something more than a tree, a new belief, a new beginning. On the young trunk, I mounted a small wooden plaque, engraved with just a few words: "Justice grows here." Everyone who passed stopped to read it, then nodded thoughtfully. They understood that the plaque didn't just refer to the lawsuit, but served as a reminder that justice doesn't appear on its own. It must be protected, nurtured, just like that young tree needs time to grow. I saw eyes light up, and some even reached out to touch the plaque, as if making a quiet promise. In that moment, I thought of my parents. If they were still alive, I imagined them standing beside me, smiling, proud that our ancestral land hadn't been buried under greed, but had become a true point of pride for generations. I also thought of my son, of the day he came home in tears after being called a land thief. Now, he was playing on the lawn with his friends, no longer burdened by shame, but holding his head high with the belief that truth always prevails. The months of confrontation, the humiliations endured, the battles of wits fought in silence, all of it now recedes into the past. It is all captured in one simple symbol: a young oak tree, a wooden plaque, and the sound of a community's laughter surrounding it. I realized then that justice is not just a verdict handed down in a courtroom, but the rebirth of trust, the erasure of fear, and the resilience of people who once stood cornered. My heart felt lighter than it had in years. I needed no personal glory, no praise or recognition. What I needed was already before me: land reborn, a community reclaiming its voice, and a future built on fairness. I walked out of the park as the sun dipped below the horizon, a quiet smile forming within. Justice had been planted, and it would grow like the oak I had just buried in the earth, steady, rooted, and strong through time. I still remember that fateful morning when Karen Aldridge stood in the middle of the construction site, pointed toward the half-built houses, and arrogantly shouted, "This land belongs to HOA now." That declaration hung over me and my family like a suspended sentence. It didn't just strip away ownership, crushed our dignity, and turned me into a laughingstock in the eyes of the entire community. For a long time, that sentence echoed in my head like a hammer striking steel, forcing me to carry shame and fury in silence. But now, everything has reversed. The HOA is dissolved, the illegal houses have been torn down, and that piece of land is no longer a trophy of greed, but has returned to its rightful place. I stood in the new park, watching the grass stretch wide and hearing the laughter of children fill the air, and I knew deep in my chest that I had walked full length just. The land was no longer just legally mine. It had become part of a shared memory, a space where safety and fairness finally take root. I stepped onto the small wooden platform built in the center of the park, where residents gathered for the dedication. Looking out at the faces before me, I saw people who had once turned their back, who had mocked, but today they all stood side by side. I took a deep breath and spoke. Never let someone else define your worth. When you stay silent, they believe they have the right, but when you rise, the truth becomes clear. Power doesn't lie in the hands of a board. It lies in the courage of each. My words echoed through the crowd, and silence followed. Many nodded, some gripped each other's hand. In their eyes, I didn't just see agreement. I saw resolve to protect what they had just claimed. The mistakes past had left scars, but they also left a lesson. A community is only strong when no one is forced to bow to injustice. I looked toward the young oak tree I had planted the day before, the wooden plaque still catching the sunlight. Justice grows here. It served as a reminder that this journey was never just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced or crushed under the weight of false authority. I believed that one day, as the tree grew tall, people would tell this story as proof of the power of truth. Justice may be slow. It may demand that we endure loss before seeing result, but when it arrives, it leaves no space for injustice to hide. Karen Aldridge once believed she was untouchable, but in the end, that belief is what brought her down. And this community, after everything, has learned to stand upright, no longer bending to anyone. I stepped down from the platform and melted into the crowd, a quiet peace settling over me. My fight was over, but I knew what it had left behind would remain. The land had been reborn, the community had rediscovered itself, and I had finally found the peace I had long awaited. As the wind moved gently through the tree branches, I could almost hear my father's voice. You kept the land, and more importantly, you kept justice. Looking back on the entire journey, I can finally feel the true weight of the word justice. From the day Karen Aldridge stood in the middle of the construction site, her voice laced with arrogance, to the final moment when the oak tree I planted skyward on a reclaimed piece of land, this was never just a legal battle. It was the awakening of a community after years of submission. I haven't forgotten those first days, when the HOA board surrounded me with fines, when I was ridiculed during meetings, when even my own neighbors looked at at me with contempt. Nor have I forgotten the pain of my son coming home with red eyes, carrying on his back the insults passed down from the mouths of adults to their children. Each of those events was a needle to my pride, leaving me no choice but to stand and face it all. When I stepped onto the legal path, I knew exactly what I was up against. A machine long accustomed to applaud. Karen had every trick, every connection, and a whole community that once trusted her blindly. But that blind faith proved to be her greatest weakness, because when the truth surfaced, that trust turned into fury. The biggest twist wasn't in the documents I presented or the recording that exposed Karen's lie. It was in that moment that the community began to turn its back on her. People who once stayed silent stood up and said, "I was wrong." Those who followed the crowd admitted, "I was deceived too." In that moment, I knew I was no longer alone, and justice was no longer a solitary battle. It had become the awakening of a collective. When the judge struck the gavel and declared all 120 homes illegally built, I didn't feel the triumph people might have expected. What settled inside me was a strange calm, because the verdict wasn't just for me, it was for an entire community that had been manipulated. Watching Karen collapse, her makeup smeared and dignity lost, didn't bring me joy. It brought me clarity. Arrogance and deception, no matter how carefully hidden, will collapse under the light of justice. And when her fate, twisted in tears, appeared on national news, I realized this was no longer the story of a neighborhood. It had become a warning for any place where someone believes they are above the law. But the greatest victory wasn't that I kept my family's land. It was that Lakeshore found a way to begin again. When the residents signed the petition to dissolve the HOA, they were cutting the chain that had held them down. The image of the elderly man, hands trembling as he said, "We've been afraid for too long, will stay with me forever," captured not the suffering we endured, but the precise moment broke free. The day the city approved the new neighborhood council, I declined the offer to leave, because justice doesn't need another person in power. It needs a group committed to transparency. And when the community park was finally built on land once marked by greed, I felt a lightness in my chest. The sound of children's laughter on the green lawn, the sight of the oak tree I planted beside the plaque that read, "Justice grows here," were not just for me. They were for anyone who has ever walked through the dark. That land no longer held empty promises. It had become the place where a community rediscovered itself. Looking back, I realize this story carries many lessons. First, the truth holds a more enduring power than any fabricated authority. Karen had an entire board behind her, yet a single land survey map and a recorded voice were enough to dismantle it all. Second, silence only feeds injustice, but when one person dares to speak up, others find the courage to do the same. And when an entire community raises its voice, even the most authoritarian figure begins to tremble. Third, justice may not always come quick, but it arrives when it's meant to, and when it does, clears away every falsehood, leaving no room for excuse. For me, the most important lesson is the value of believing in yourself. If I had given up on day one, Lakeshore would still lie under the shadow of the HOA. But by holding my ground, I didn't just reclaim land. I gave my son, and the generations to come, a greater inheritance, the legacy of truth, and the belief that no one has the right to define your worth but you. Now, every time I walk past the park, I glance up at the young oak tree and smile. It grows a little more each day, its roots digging deeper into the soil, just as justice has taken root in this community. I know the future will bring its own challenges, but the lessons from this story will be told again, not to reopen wounds, but to remind us that when we dare to stand, even the strongest walls of injustice fall. And when I think about it all, I have only one message for anyone facing oppression anywhere. Believe in the truth, because justice may be slow, but when it comes, it wipes out every shadow.